I don't think anybody was really prepared for what had happened. It was unprecedented. So why would you have a plan for a flood where it never floods?
No, we didn't have a disaster plan. I wish we had, but we didn't. So it was a few days before I got to go in the library to see, and it was bad.
As far as a disaster prevention or plan, I don't think that I know we didn't have a written plan.
The museum itself was not impacted in the way that other institutions were, but our friends at the African American Museum of Bowling Green were hit. And the very next day, they then suffered an electrical fire that very night. They're an all-volunteer institution. They don't really have the manpower. They don't have the policies and procedures necessarily that we do, because we had a disaster plan. We had all this training.
One of the most difficult things to ascertain that has to be figured out pretty well immediately is what's going on up Red River. We have in Wolfe County, we have Hazel Green. Red River runs right through. Having a contact with someone there that can keep us constantly in touch with what's going on, how high is it there compared to past floods, is very important.
So when the flood happened, we had a disaster preparedness draft plan, and we just found ourselves really reacting to the flood. We coincidentally found that many of the things that we did sort of organically followed the disaster preparedness plan. One of the key lessons learned is, moving forward, we'll be sure to have a detailed disaster preparedness plan to be able to work from and implement in future disasters.
Are you ready? That's the overriding question that disaster preparedness experts and those who have experienced natural disasters within Kentucky's borders would ask you. Hopefully, after today's session, you'll be a step closer to answering that for yourself. I'm Bill Goodman, Executive Director of Kentucky Humanities, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Disaster Preparedness online series. We're pleased you've taken time to join us for this important program focusing on disaster readiness and the basic needs to consider as you develop an emergency preparedness plan. This series is made possible with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Our thanks as well to our many partners, including Performing Arts Readiness, the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response, the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation, the Kentucky Historical Society, Kentucky Arts Council, the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives, and finally, to the men and women who have shared their remarkable real-life stories. We appreciate how your experiences will help others to learn about the importance of disaster preparedness. Now, I'll turn it over to our instructors for this session, Tom Clarison, Jan Newcomb, and Elena Gregg.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first session in our series on, we're focusing on disaster readiness. And I'm Tom Clarison from Performing Arts Readiness. And I wanted my colleagues to have a chance to give a quick introduction before we go into our program.
Hi, thanks, Tom. I'm Jan Newcomb. I'm Executive Director of the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response. And I'm also, I also work with Tom on the Performing Arts Readiness Project.
Hi, everybody. I'm Elena Gregg, the Emergency Programs Manager for the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation.
Right. Thank you. Well, let's move over to our presentation at this point. And we wanted to give all of you our contact information so that you can get in touch with us after the session. But the most important thing is please use the chat anytime today as you need to or have a question, and we will try to answer the chat questions as we're moving through our presentation. We wanted to thank Bill, Kathleen, and Kentucky Humanities for sponsoring the webinar series over the next 6 weeks, and we'll be talking with you about our other topics as we move through the program today. So on the next slide, we can get into a couple of quick questions. So we wanted to find out a little bit of information from all of you. One thing is we'll have a couple of polls to start up here, and then also in the chat, if you can put your name and organization after we do these poll questions, that will be excellent. So we wanted to find out where you are and what type of organization you represent, as well as your role at the institution. So if you could give a quick vote on our poll, that would be great. And we will be able to find out some of the information of where people are from. We wanted to try to do this for our first session, and we'll be asking some poll questions through all of our questions in the future. Getting an idea of all the types of organizations that are represented here, and if you do have a plan, is really important as we move forward thinking about the whole idea of the preparedness and recovery activities. And then our fourth session in early September is really going to focus on a number of the resources that are available. So you can see that we've got a wide variety of organizations that are represented in our registration today, all the way from humanities organizations at libraries, archives, and museums to arts organizations, maybe performing arts centers, arts councils, and arts and crafts organizations. So we'll be able to see the view the information from the polls in just a moment. And we have two things real quickly. There's a note that I got on chat that the chat function was disabled, but let's go over to the poll very quickly. And we see that we've got libraries are the largest group. We have an other group, and then we have museums, schools, and arts organizations with a pretty good range of answers as well. So I'm really interested in seeing if those trends go along as we have more of our sessions. Okay, with the next, if we can get the other poll results up as we go along, that would be great. And we would like to have you answer another question too on your organization's plan. Does your organization currently have a formal disaster recovery plan? And this is a single choice question. Yes, no. If you don't know, that is fine. And that's something that we will ask you to find out before our next session. And then, is your plan in progress? We heard a couple of people in the video saying that they had a plan in progress. So we'll look to see what the results are here as well. And that will help us, again, develop our and customize and tailor our discussions as we go along. Okay. We actually have a pretty good amount of people with plans. So no is 42%, and yes is 25%, which is pretty good. The in progress, hey, that's really good. And hopefully, as we go along, we can give you some ideas to add to your plan as you're developing it. And so that's great. Excellent. Thank you. Well, Let's talk a little bit about the background that Jan and Elena and I bring to the discussion. And we have some sort of definitions that we've come up with that we've been utilizing for quite a while. What is readiness? Well, we consider it being in a posture to be resilient and prepared for whatever type of crisis, emergency, or disaster might arise at your organization. Jan always talks about the idea that this is the dancer being ready to move, being ready to spring into action. And so we need to be ready to spring into action if we do have any type of disaster. A readiness plan, that's a combination of documents, processes, and training, especially training. And we'll be going through that and talking about that a number of times during our sessions, that formulates what your organization and its leadership and staff should do when the unexpected, the crisis, emergency, or disaster arises. And one of the things that we think about is it's like an organizational muscle that you train and strengthen over time. And it's never really done, never really complete. It's something that you can add to and learn from. And you heard from Appleshop that they had a number of things that they learned and are going from there. Okay, on our next slide. So one of the things that we have been talking about when we've been presenting in the past year is that as devastating as the pandemic was for everyone, there have been a wide variety of disasters in the past several years that have continued to occur. And you can see we have a listing of the types of disasters: hurricanes, tornadoes, water crisis, wildfires. I just heard about a wildfire along the California and Nevada border, widespread droughts. So these are things that we have to continue to deal with. And we know that in Kentucky, in Western Kentucky, where I have been to see some of the destruction that happened, you had a tornado and then we've had the more recent flooding. And the other thing we have to think about is that hurricane season is upon us. And so we need to watch out for that, but also watch out for any of the types of storms that generates. One of the things that we always say, another sort of definitional thing, is that all disasters are local. Some cover a large geographic area, but flooding, whether it's from a hurricane, a river flood, or a leaky pipe, often can have the same disastrous effect on an organization. So when we think about this also, we have to think about the man-made disasters. Unfortunately, we have a lot of situations where there has been gun violence or that type of situation. And so we have to begin to plan for those as well. So today, we want to talk about how you, as an informed and prepared cultural and arts leader, can facilitate nimble, coordinated, and effective responses to crises and disasters. You can create resilience within your organization that can mean the difference between survival and bankruptcy. Rather than trying to participate all of the possible crises that might happen, no matter what the cause, I think what you should do is do a risk assessment and focus on what might happen in your area, and then determine your plans, policies, and procedures for all of your critical business functions. And the critical business functions are going to be different in a library, a museum, an arts organization. And then review the lessons learned after you have a disaster and update your planning and training protocols. Planning definitely is a never-ending process, and it's a process of continual improvement. And so what I would say with this is the idea that you really need to be able to review and practice the plans. And one of the things that people used to say a while ago was that you needed to be able to review your plan, practice your plan once a year. I'd say it's probably once every 6 months now, because we're seeing with changes of seasons and with weather disasters that we need to do this even a little bit more. Planning is definitely cheaper, less stressful and less expensive than learning on the job. Some of the most recent stats that we've seen are that every $1 spent on planning will save you up to $7 on response. So it's also something that can give you a financial benefit. On our next slide, what we've been leading up to is understanding why all hazards planning is important for you to know. What are the goals for an up-to-date all hazards plan? How will it aid you? I think that there are a number of different ways. The biggest thing is to identify and protect staff, artists, audience members, your patrons at your library or museum, and priority assets and vital records. This is going to be different in every type of institution and in every institution in general. A useful exercise might be to ask your staff at the next time you have a staff get together, if you could save one thing in a disaster, what would it be? And you'll get different answers from different departments and different positions. And that should provide you a better picture of the organization. Reducing the risk of a disaster. As we learned, prevention is the cheapest and most effective disaster response. Ensuring your capability to resume operations after a disaster. If you have well-conceived plans and it's within a larger structure of your organization, a larger sort of policy basis for running your organization, that should help you get back up and running faster. And increase the ability to recover from damage or loss of assets. This is especially important for any unique or rare materials such as archival and museum objects, an orchestra's library of music, theatrical posters, sets, props, etc. So looking at all of those things and making sure that you have an inventory of your assets before and after a disaster happens is very important. On the next slide, I'm going to give you a very quick run through of the kind of things that we have as components of an all hazards disaster plan. And this is really, as we've said, an information gathering process to analyze information and develop a plan of action. It's a working document that, as we said, should be regularly tested, revised, practiced. And here are some of the most common components: the introduction, the purpose, the author, the organization, and a series of schedules for updates, and the most recent date it's been revised. Having a 10-year-old disaster response plan may not be very helpful because all of the people who are on staff may have turned over. You might have gone to a different building or have different types of changes to your building. Evacuation plans for your staff, patrons, and any types of performers that you might have. The communications plan. We're going to talk a lot about communications as this session goes on, but having staff contact information and other emergency contacts are helpful. Emergency procedures. This probably is one of the most important things that you can do after you assess your risks. And this is responding to a variety of emergencies. Are fires, either fires that might be caused in other buildings or by the businesses around you, bomb threats, power outages, medical or weather problems. Are those the biggest things that you are faced with? If so, think about the ways to respond differently to those different types of disasters. And this includes instructions for building evacuation and assembly as well. Another important thing is those facilities plans. Jan and I talk about this a lot, and we call it the what is where aspect of things. Where are the shutoff valves? Where are the circuit breakers? If you can include floor plans and maintenance schedules and a description of all of your major systems, including fire detection and suppression and security systems, that is really important. And you need to include any remodeling that you've done, cubes, temporary walls, any type of changes that you've made in your building. The resource list: outside emergency personnel, police, fire, utilities, hospitals for sure, but are there vendors or consultants that you oftentimes use? Electricians. I've just been talking to an organization that's had a bunch of elevator failures, and they said, unfortunately, they have their elevator company on speed dial. Carpet cleaners, glass replacement, all of those types of resources is important. And one of the things that we would be really interested in having you note is, do you have your insurance information and expenditure authorization information close by? If you have a disaster, you need to know how you're covered and if you're covered and who to get in touch with for that. And then response procedures, we'll be talking about that, but that's building team functions and responsibilities. It's building a supplies list, and then the idea of how to salvage specific types of materials. And that's something that we're going to be focusing on quite a bit in our next two sessions, the idea of what to do to salvage materials. Now, on our next slide, there's a really, I think, an interesting thing that we need to think about, how disasters impact arts and culture. And I think everybody always thinks of that first circle up there, the idea of loss of income. This can be everything from gate or entry fees or sales from your shop. And for arts organizations, it can be canceled performances, loss of audience for performances, canceled galas and classes. Yes, that is very important. But we also need to think about the loss and damage and destruction of property. For arts organizations, that's sets, costumes, and scores. But for libraries, archives, and museums, that's texts, it's office equipment, it's files, it's your exhibit materials. And in some cases, it might be the tools used to create art materials, paint, paintbrushes, canvas, even computers. So the damage to property is important. I always think a lot, because I've been on site so many times, of loss of facilities. And this can be a facility that holds your collection materials, or a performance or rehearsal facility for arts organizations, but it can also be office spaces and offsite storage. And if your offsite storage is several miles away from where your main base of operations is, it may be affected by a disaster that doesn't even affect your organization. So knowing about and being able to be vigilant and keep a watch on that type of situation is very important. And then finally, I think the most important thing is health issues. And this can be injury or loss of life and health. But we also want to consider, and I know this is something that we've talked with a number of Kentucky organizations about, the emotional impact that makes it difficult or impossible for people to work or create work, or in the case of artists, perform. So what we want you to think about is, it's not just a money impact. There are a lot of other impacts to look at, and that's why we need to build some of our plans. And a way to do that is something that we can see in the next slide here, and that is through emergency management. And when you work with your fire, police, and county emergency managers, you'll hear a lot about this sort of emergency management cycle. So we wanted to talk for just a moment about these concepts. In the step of preparedness that we're talking about today, this is planning, supplies, building a team. Response is the immediate response through the first 48 to even 72 hours. What you can do before help arrives is quite important. Recovery, this could be short term. How can we get ourselves reopened and be open for our patrons and our audiences? Do we need to use a different facility? And in case there's been a lot of damage to your facility, what is the long-term prognosis? What is your long-term recovery looking like? And then mitigation is at the top of the cycle. And then we start to think about the cycle again, but it's really, what can we do to make the next time a disaster happens less severe and less damaging? So those are some quick definitions that we can go with as we move forward. So I want to take just a moment or two to talk about some of the partners that we have that we work with. So development of emergency management by the arts and cultural heritage sector of FEMA during the response to Hurricane Katrina exposed some weaknesses, how the cultural community was set up to deal with disasters. And this led to actually a resurgence of emergency management thinking across the country. I think that the library, archives, and museum world, through the work of heritage preservation, the Heritage Emergency National Task Force, and now FAIC's emergency services, have been great, and there's a great network built up. But one of the things that we've seen in the arts is the idea of having some of the national arts funders step in and help arts organizations think about directions that they can go and work with. So my organization, Performing Arts Readiness, does a lot of training, provides resources and funding. Jan's organization, she'll talk a little bit about this today, but actually we'll talk about it throughout the set of sessions that we're doing, has advocacy and networking work that it does. The Arts Ready planning tool is something that we'll talk about, especially in session 4. And we work very closely with the Craft Emergency Relief Fund, or SURF Plus, the artist safety net for individual crafts organizations. And we now are working with the Heritage Emergency National Task Force and others to make sure that there's this great sort of blanket coverage for the types of situations that we might have. So our next slide is just a quick introduction to the Performing Arts Readiness Project, and we'll talk more about this in some of our other sessions as well. And our next slide after this shows information on the different types of services that we have. We want to reach both producing and presenting organizations and organizations with or without facilities. That might be organizations that have bricks and mortar, or on the other hand, might have a situation where they are a touring company. And so we also, because I have about 30 years of background working with libraries and archives and museums, make many of these services and many of these activities available to the cultural heritage community as well. So we do a lot of outreach work and community engagement with organizations from local arts organizations to state arts and humanities agencies. We have a website with case studies, a mailing list with nearly 4,000 people on it, and social media that used to be something where we posted once a week. Now we're posting probably 2 or 3 times a day. And Steve Eberhard, Jan and my colleague, is pretty vigilant about putting good information out on that resource. Our Circuit Rider project is something where we have a half-time staff member in a city or state area to really concentrate on providing help. We have templates and tools like the Arts Ready D-Plan tool for automated disaster planning, training and conference programming. We have 20 different webinars. 20 webinars that are offered live on a quarterly basis, or you can reach through recordings as well. And we are right in the middle of offering funding for disaster networks and disaster planning for arts organizations. So please see our website for information about that. We've had a special focus on festival safety, arts administration programs at colleges and universities, and working with emergency management programs around the country as well. We'll talk a lot more about these resources as we go along in our other sessions, but now I want to turn the mic over to Jan to talk about NCAPER's work in readiness and some of the key concepts in preparing for disasters.
Thanks, Tom. We could, there, we have the NCAPER slide. I want to also remind everyone that you can write in questions. We'd love to have your questions. Tom has promised to watch that area of the screen so that we can be interrupted if there's something that you want to ask right in the moment. The National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response, we obviously call it NCAPER because it's a mouthful. It was formed in 2006, really after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, when we realized that there were significant losses and devastation suffered by artists and creative economies that were never really addressed by the emergency response and especially FEMA, the artists themselves and arts organizations weren't really part of that kind of response. So we wanted to fill this critical void in arts assistance. So NCAPER is really the only national discipline agnostic arts readiness, response, and recovery organization within the arts sector. And we have developed a response system that serves as a safety net to complement services of general relief providers as a stopgap measure for those not served by federal disaster programs. So we do this by advocating for preparedness and disaster support for the entire arts sector through publications and resource development. We also facilitate post-disaster virtual convenings for affected artists and arts organizations to connect them to funders, service organizations, and businesses who could help with their needs. We did this twice in Kentucky, both Western Kentucky after the tornadoes and Eastern Kentucky after that horrible flooding. We also train arts responders to work with their communities on readiness and mitigation projects. We're finding that to be very successful. We have support from the Tremaine Foundation. And those coaches are called CAM coaches, and CAM is crisis analysis and mitigation. So on the next slide, it shows the steering committee organizational members. Can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. And you see a wide variety of organizations. New York Foundation for the Arts. So they're both, and Music Cares, they both support individual artists. And we have grant makers in the arts. And Surf Plus, which is the artist safety net that Tom mentioned, National Endowment, South Arts particularly because South seems to be the cornerstone of disasters at this point, Americans for the Arts, and of course the Entertainment Community Fund, which is the Actors Fund, formerly the Actors Fund. So we have a lot of support throughout the United States and also from many disciplines. On the next slide, we talk about the ABCs of critical skills for readiness planning and assessing risk, being nimble, and communicating. After we came up with these ABCs actually during COVID and the shutdown for everyone, when we realized how important it was that the organizations that seemed to respond quickly had done some of this planning prior to COVID happening. So assessing risk, really understanding and knowing where your liabilities are and what assets need to be protected and how they should be protected is very important. And we'll go into that a little bit more on the next slide. But being nimble is if you're prepared and have thought about what ifs and when they become when ifs in your organization, so you can adapt quickly to crises and other potentially harmful situations. And then communicating is the most important skill a leader can have. And I cannot emphasize that more strongly. We found when we taught at Baruch College, a 3-credit course during COVID, many of these young people who were in the graduate course we taught worked at major arts and cultural institutions, and they had no idea if they were going to get paid or if they should show up. There was a lack of communication that you would think within some of these larger organizations, you know, that would be a given. So I always tell people, make sure your internal stakeholders are kept apprised of all things that are happening. So let's talk about assessing risk a little more. Thank you. we, as in the D-Plan Arts Ready online tool, we have 9 functional areas that really arts organizations, cultural organizations, libraries, everybody, their answers may be different, their assessment may be different, but you really have all of these critical areas. Collections and assets. And Tom mentioned that, of course, our performing arts organizations sometimes say, well, we don't have collections. And yes, you've got a musical library, or you've got costumes, things like that. Also, your people, whether it's staff people, donors, patrons, just the general public, you have functional areas that need to be reviewed as far as being prepared. Finances, of course, and facilities. Whether you own or rent or tour, you really need to know all those things that Tom was talking about before, like how to turn off the water, how to activate, where are the fire retardant activators, things like that. And of course, IT is a very, as we all know, very critical function to make sure you have the necessary security taken care of. Communications, again, I can't emphasize that enough. It's like location, location, location is for realtors. Making sure that you have messages and you communicate often. And community, your interaction with the community is very important. You need to get your word out there and making sure that people know you're still around, or whatever is happening. And of course, your programs. You need to, if you have visiting artists or whatever, you need to know how to communicate and respond. Also, and probably the most important, is training and drills. When you go through something, you want to make sure you assess it and debrief and improve how you respond the next time. So in the next slide, this is just the low-hanging fruit. Identifying the hazards that you in your place are really are going to be the first step of, where are you? Are you in the city, or are you in a rural area? And how close are you to nearby services? I mean, are you an hour away from the responding fire trucks, or are they next door? And so really knowing where things are and also how to contact them is very important. Who are your neighbors? I always make the comment about if you don't have good zoning, you may have like a chemical plant across from you. You better know how to respond if something should happen, or a railroad crossing, and what public infrastructure surrounds your building, and where are other things happening. And so that's important, just to look at where you are, your own surrounding, your own setting. And on the next slide, you're looking internally, your building maintenance, whether you own or rent or visit, really make sure you look at where everything is, and you know, inspecting the electrical, the HVAC, plumbing, masonry, fire suppression, drainage. I had, in my own experience, we almost all died of carbon monoxide poisoning because the chimney was plugged in our office, and there were no alarms, carbon monoxide alarms. So you need to make sure you're covered, and look for the daisy chains, the crumbling plaster, and ceiling tiles, you know, when there's a tide line around them. And also for clogged drains, as we mentioned, roof drainage and HVAC drip pans. These are all important to understand how you can help yourself and know who's responsible for taking care of these problems if they arrive. But of course, on the next slide, you realize that human-made hazards are probably the most heinous, and we don't have as a great ability of predicting. So even with all the negative effects of climate change, the fastest growing disasters are human-made. And anybody who has lived through the last 5 years or so, we know that this is a growing concern, and we need to definitely have a plan in place. So let's go next slide. We're going to go talking about being nimble. And this is you as in your leadership position, as staff position, is how do you really respond and react quickly? And I think the most important thing on this slide is focus on what you can change. I mean, we can't predict all that's going to happen. And when things do happen, how can we individually look and learn from crises and disasters, and really looking forward and being able to move quickly is always improves your readiness and preparedness situation. So and communicating in the next slide, I mentioned you can't have too much of communication, but you really need to have communicate often, and you should have messages for staff, for donors, for patrons, for the general public, and do this often. And these are things you can actually prepare in advance and look at and have them queued up if something happens. You can develop them, and one thing that we always say, make sure everyone in the organization understands who is in charge of communicating. This is important. Tom had a situation where a board chairman, not knowing after some sort of disaster, thought he should take it upon himself to answer questions, whereas the CEO already had a response prepared, and unfortunately the responses were not the same. So understanding who's in charge, who's in command, and that everybody understands that, very important. So the importance of targeted communications, I've mentioned, can't mention it enough. Once a crisis and a disaster occurs, you want to have provide access to archived performances. These three things on the bottom, those were outcomes of successful organizations during COVID, how they jumped right into, because they had a plan in place, had plans in place, they jumped right into, okay, how can we react to this? What can we do? And so providing access to archived performances, from my background in performing arts, that was exciting. And then developing human interest stories of performers and staff, and communicating those stories online or in social media. That was really good for people to see that there was activity. And then collaborating with current allies and new partners. That has become really the definition of being nimble, and being able to work with new partners who bring different assets and skill sets. And this has been developing these kinds of networks has been very good outcome of successful organizations dealing with crises and disasters. So on the next slide, here we are, NCAPER, Performing Arts Readiness, and we plan Arts Ready, and SURF, Plus. SURF is the Craft Emergency Response Fund for artists. And they also have some wonderful tools that really for any arts organization or artists, cultural organizations work. I find their Studio Protector tool especially effective. So these are all organizations that are aware of what might be needed by the arts community and cultural community, and we encourage you to get to know us. Now I'm going to turn us over to Elena, who is going to talk about what she does in her organization. Thanks.
Thank you, Jan. And just a quick reminder for everybody attending today to put your questions in the Q&A box. That way we can keep track of them and have them all in one place. So let's see here. All right. So for my part today, I'm going to discuss a few of the programs that we have at the Foundation for Advancement and Conservation that can help you all as you consider disaster preparedness. These are programs that are very much involved in the preparedness phase and can help with response and recovery as well. And then I'm also going to share a few helpful tips that will just be extra on top of what Tom and Jan have already shared, which has all been really wonderful information. So in my role, I manage several groups, including the National Heritage Responders and the Alliance for Response Initiative. So I will first start with the National Heritage Responders on the next slide. So this is a group of over 100 volunteers that are located across the country. They have specialties ranging from emergency management to collections care. We bring them into the group based on where they're located and what specialty they have. So for example, we currently have a big gap in the Midwest. So we're often looking for people that have, textiles or paintings or some other type of specialty that are located in areas that are not represented already. Everybody in the National Heritage Responders has been trained in foundational collections emergency response. And many of our volunteers come into the group having responded to disasters, either at their own institutions or in their homes. So this is especially true for volunteers that are located in the South and the Southeast. We facilitate physical deployments. They monitor a 24/7 hotline, and that's really the easiest way to get in touch with our volunteers by calling the number on the screen here, 202-661-8068, or by email. But we also, when the circumstances align, we will deploy teams of volunteers to impacted disaster sites as well. We also, since the COVID-19 pandemic, we've launched a virtual assessment model. So we can do video assessments and work with institutions to advise from afar. We also, since 2021, have set up a public helpline email. So NHR public helpline at culturalheritage.org. Anybody from the public or community members can email our group through that email address and can get insight onto how to protect their personal items, either before an event or after something has happened. And just on a personal note, I know Jan also just went through a moving process, but I realized that I had not applied the skills that I know through my professional life and my personal life. And I didn't make a full inventory of everything that I was moving from one home to another, and have realized that I've lost a few things along the way. So it's important, I think, to apply some of these lessons to your life at home, because the more prepared we are as individuals, the better we can serve our institutions. Next slide. So now I'll talk about the Alliance for Response Initiative. And quickly, I will discuss more about National Heritage Responders in the next few series, the next few webinars, because we have done a series of deployments in Kentucky, and I think it'll be helpful to show what sort of activities the group has been involved in and can help with. But more on that in the next session. So Alliance for Response. This is an initiative that was launched in 2003. The goal is really to bring together cultural stewards and emergency professionals at the local level. We aim to create local cooperative disaster communities around the country. And FAIC is involved really in two key ways. We help regions get started. So we have a whole handbook on how to get a network going. We often help facilitate a kickoff forum, which is a one-day networking event for emergency management and cultural heritage people to come together. They often have time to speak to one another, to present on different hazards inherent to their region that they want to address as a group. And it really just allows relationship building through this kind of symposium-like event. Each group has their own priorities and initiatives, and at FAIC, we prefer it that way. We know that each region is different, and what works in Seattle might not work in Texas. So whatever everybody wants to do is great. The second way we are involved is really to help keep networks engaged long-term. Volunteer networks are difficult to keep the momentum going. So we provide micro grants. We've been doing this for the past few years and really hope to keep this program going, where we provide small amounts of funds to networks to support different activities. This could be a training opportunity or setting up a supply cache in your region. We also provide about 2 webinars a year to Alliance for Response Networks. We've covered topics including health and safety considerations in disasters, the psychology of disasters, working with insurance providers, working with disaster recovery companies. So things that different groups are dealing with and thinking about often. And then we set up an advisory committee a couple years ago where every 3 months, each network is encouraged to send 2 people to a meeting that we hold. And we cover a distinct topic every meeting. So 2 weeks ago, we covered bylaws and governance. So how networks are setting themselves up. We've covered communications. In the fall, we'll cover funding. So how networks get money to do things and to keep their group engaged. But yeah, so we try and get networks started, and then we try to sustain them long term. Next slide, please. Here is a map of all of the networks that are currently set up around the country. The blue stars represent the networks that came online in 2022. So Chicago and Charleston kicked off in June of last year. The green stars represent the 2 networks that we will bring online in the next year. So New Hampshire will kick off in September of this year, and Arizona in 2024. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the big question: why should we plan for cultural resources? The short answer is that cultural resources are often the lifeblood of most communities. Museums, libraries, historic sites, archives, they all hold a collective history, and many of these documents, artifacts, structures cannot be replaced. Also, collections hold a high monetary value, both in the objects themselves and in the tourism dollars that they attract. And from a life safety perspective, visitors to cultural institutions, including large groups, can be at risk during emergencies. So it's super important to plan. Finally, I know that many institutions can serve a role in the recovery process. They'll serve as gathering places, information centers, educational resources. They're also just icons of community identity. And so knowing that symbols of a community have survived is really important for the psychology of recovery and how people go through the recovery process. In the next few slides, I'm going to share a few ways to engage emergency management professionals to help get your institution better prepared. So first, one relatively easy way to engage emergency management is through exercises. So think about ways that your institution can offer to help meet training needs, and this can be a reciprocal process. So this could be a unique aspect of your facility that may be of interest to emergency personnel. For example, I know of a museum who had a clock tower, and they offered that as a tool for rappelling exercise to emergency management. But if nothing else, you likely could facilitate or have a space to facilitate a tabletop exercise. And for those of you that aren't familiar with tabletops, it's really a space where people can join around a table and walk through a disaster exercise. So it's an opportunity to talk through how things might go and identify gaps before an event actually happens. I personally think that exercise is really helpful before like anything like a construction project. If you're going to do a big move of a collection, do a tabletop exercise. Think about ways that things can go wrong, so that you kind of are primed when things inevitably go wrong. And then also invite emergency managers and people from local emergency management to be involved in your exercises. This is a great way to familiarize them with your site and with your collections, so that in the heat of the moment, they kind of know how to navigate, which doors are not actually exits or which doors will lead to a secret passageway. That's all important information for them to be aware of. Next slide, please. And then learning to speak the language. I think it is fair to say that both sectors have a lot of acronyms. I know that I speak in acronyms a lot and have to catch myself often, but understanding which acronyms emergency management is using is really helpful. And it is truly a language to bridge the gap between our two sectors. Next slide. The key one is the incident command system. This is a system that allows people to understand chain of command in an emergency setting. ICS can be, it's intended to be a very flexible model and can be scaled up to support a large event like the Super Bowl. It can be scaled down to be applied to something as simple as a birthday party. But it's often used in disaster settings because it's a very clear and nimble process that can be adapted to any sort of situation. I also think it's really helpful to take local community emergency response trainings, or CERT. They're often offered through county emergency management offices. They're free and they get you connected to the local emergency management community. They also kind of show how emergency management is looking at a process and makes you understand their thought process when going through a disastrous event. Next slide. Sharing essential information in advance. This is really important. The more information you have prepared in advance, the easier it will be to salvage your collection and to maintain a good relationship with emergency responders. So any information that you can share on the front end is going to be helpful, but especially information about your facilities. I know Tom and Jan already mentioned some of the facilities information that you can share, but yeah, oddities about your structure, information about collections hazards, and I'll get into that a little more. Yeah, there we go. Next slide. So yeah, maps of the institution showing entrances, exits, elevators, utility shutoffs, alarm and sprinkler systems, all very important. Names of site locations, including various names. I know at my previous employer, a historic house museum in South Florida, we'd often have several names for the same place. And that's actually helpful to share so that when you're going through an emergency response and several people are referring to the same structure with different names, that's already been communicated. And then blueprints of the buildings, so floor and room plans, room names or numbers, locations and types of hazardous materials. For example, if you have ammunition, medical supplies, or preserved specimens, that's all very important to communicate. All right, next slide. Stewards of collections are often intimately familiar with the risks contained in their collections, but local fire station personnel, they might not know about your nitrate film. They might not know about taxidermy specimens, your mercury mirror. All of that is important to share, and just consider the fact that in an emergency situation, already dangerous materials will become more dangerous. So it's very, as when Tom was talking about the risk assessment, this is all important information to include in there. All right, and then discuss your priorities and determine ways to share that information. So consider monetary value, curatorial value, the stability of the material. Remember that items on loan to your institution should be the first priority. So having a plan to communicate with the institution that has sent you different pieces. And then priority items generally should be marked on your facility plans. So you can use shading or colored notations. You could take photographs and include those into the plan. And then reflective tape on shelves and collection storage to indicate priority items. That's also helpful. Next slide, please. So ultimately, sustained collaboration will really help keep some of these practices going. And after emergency events, it's really helpful to do like an after action report or just like a hot wash to discuss how things went and to see how things can be improved for future events. That's all for me.
Okay, thank you, Elena. And during your part of the session, we got a ton of questions that have started to pop in into the Q&A area, so that's great. And one of them is directly related to what you were talking about. Are there fees for NHR, food and housing for them, et cetera? That would be great to know about.
Great question. And no, all of NHR's services are free. We support the volunteer corps at FAIC, and if we do a physical deployment, we have funds to set all of them up with housing. We support their travel, we feed them. So there are no expenses for the host institution or the host region.
Great. And then how do you do a risk assessment in a rural community? And are there experts available to help with this? And I know, Elena, you have a lot that you can tell about this, and I might jump in with a couple of other things as well.
Yeah, I think generally I would start by just getting in touch with your local emergency management group. So yeah, I mean, start there, get in touch with them, see what their plan is, and then kind of get that, like take pieces of that and apply it to your institution. Yeah, I'm not sure. Is this in regards to like a specific site or just a community at large?
And I think we may get another question related to that popping up here. One of the things that I would say that we could look at is to help with a risk assessment, ahead of time as you're doing some of your planning. Another thing that Elena does a lot of pointing people towards are the National Endowment for the Humanities. They have a program called Preservation Assistance Grants, and that can help organizations get an idea of what their risks are, what their collection condition, building condition, procedures and that type of things are, and how those are available. So I would say work with Kentucky Humanities and look at National Endowment for the Humanities for those types of grants. See if your local arts agency or state arts agency might be able to help you do a risk assessment as well. And in a lot of cases, these can be grant supported, or in some cases, they can be free services as well. And the other thing is, I think both at FAIC and at a couple of other resources, and we'll talk about this in our final session, there are some tools that you can work through and sort of do a self-assessment. So we'll definitely feature that as we go along. So that is a great one. Yes, Jan.
I'd like to also point out that having come from a rural area, that when you have cultural networks of your cultural partners and you then expand it to include whatever your county emergency, if it's usually county rather than city, if you're in a rural area. It's amazing how much as a group you can put together kind of your immediate needs, and I encourage, and we'll talk about that later in when we talk about network, but that's an important working together.
Great. Our last question that we have in the Q&A box is, do we have tips for what to do when typical lines of communication, phones and internet are down? And will that be covered in the next session? Maybe let's start covering that question here, and we can cover it in a couple of the upcoming sessions, particularly in the resource area as well.
Could point out one very rural community in Louisiana as part of a mitigation project. They knew that 46% of the people in Houma, Louisiana, do not have access to Wi-Fi. And so what they are doing is they have an artist designed tree that is that will be built out of I assume steel or something, and it will be resistant to category 5 winds. And it will function as the area where you can get power, because there'll be power from solar power and other means, and leave communication, so that actually you can come together and see people, but also have they also decided to have a radio station that would be the emergency radio communications system. And so everybody in the community was supporting that and would know that. And that was just one community's response, but I thought it was really good. They understood that people they didn't even have Wi-Fi in the best of times. So it's a way to deal with that.
Great, Jan. Thank you. Elena, do you have some other tips there?
Having trouble with my mute button. Yes. Sorry. Yes, sorry. Yeah, I think that's helpful. Also, and I know this is a longer term suggestion, but if you're able to work, and I feel like I really try to drive home the point of getting connected with local emergency management, because it is so helpful and impactful. But I know of several Alliance for Response networks around the country who have created a relationship where they've dedicated the Office of Emergency Management at the local level or at the county level has dedicated a seat in their emergency operations center to the network. And by having that dedicated seat, they're able to connect with other county services like public works, water and sewer, and they're able to kind of field calls that come in from institutions and then get them connected to critical resources right away. So again, I know that is longer term, but by getting kind of embedded in the system that's already in place, that helps enhance response effectiveness, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Elena. And I had one other thing that I wanted to mention, and it really builds on a little bit of what Jan was saying. You know, we had worked with the local radio stations in Houston. I'm not really a morning person, but in Houston, I was doing 6 a.m. Sessions on their local news radio station in 2001 after Tropical Storm Allison caused a lot of flooding. And I know some other people did those after Hurricane Harvey in 2017. So work with the local news station if they're still able to be on. And then the other thing is, if that is even knocked out, one of the things that we've heard of is people, FEMA starting up a FEMA radio station. And I know that Randy Silverman at University of Utah worked on that radio station in Nebraska when there was flooding out in that area a number of years ago. So certainly that is important to take a look at. We have a couple of other questions. How often should we update our contacts in the disaster relief plan? Monthly, every 6 months? I would say at least every 6 months, because people are moving, people are changing internet providers. So if you talk with them over the internet mostly, you might need to check their addresses. I think monthly might be overkill. See how 6 months goes. And if you are doing your inventory, if you're doing your check, and you find out that there are a whole bunch of people who have had situations that have changed, maybe bring it down to quarterly, something like that. I don't know, Elena or Jan, if you have any other suggestions here.
Yeah, I think twice a year is helpful. And I have always found it helpful to put it on the calendar. You know, you could have all staff invited to a calendar invite where it's like a dedicated half an hour where everybody is looking at their contact information and updating it. Or admin is updating people that have come on board or left. So it's just like there, you don't have to think about it. You'll be reminded because it's on your calendar. And otherwise it kind of just gets pushed down because it might not be top priority at the time, but it is very important to keep that going at least twice a year.
If you get turnover a lot, it's, orientation for new people, or even new board members. It's helpful that's a good way to activate it at the update.
Our last two questions are really quite a bit related. Amanda Burden had asked, in our disaster experience, we also had staff who were dealing with the disaster, a hurricane in their own homes and families. Their place of business, the art museum, wasn't a priority, or physically they couldn't get to the museum. Is there any advice of this kind of strain on employees? And one of the things that we talk about is, disaster planning should start at home. There is definitely ready.org, which is something that FEMA has that helps families get ready for disasters and disaster situations at your home. One of the things that we've started to see is local EMAs coming out, local emergency management agencies coming out to fairs and events to talk with people about the kind of work that they should do. And I may be going against what I talk about work basis wise by saying this, but I would say, your plan for home, dealing with your situation at home, family, and neighborhood is of the utmost importance. And this is another reason why we talk about, when we put together a disaster team, which we'll talk about more in our upcoming sessions, the idea of having backups, having plan B folks for those teams can really be helpful, because there may be an organization that has damage and people aren't able to get there. One of the things that I always remember is in Wichita Falls, Texas, how so many of the people who worked at the art museum there, their houses were knocked down, their cars were buried, they couldn't get there. So as Shelley says here, I think that that's really an important thing to take a look at. Preparedness starts at home. We had a question, will we receive video recordings of this? Will we also receive video recordings even if we didn't attend the session due to other sudden commitments? And that will be something that I will get an answer on this in just a minute. And I believe that you will be able to get these through Kentucky Humanities. So we will get information on that in just a moment. But I am glad to see the number of questions, really interesting questions that relate to today's discussion, but they also relate a little bit to what we're going to come up in the future with. So just very quickly, I want to be sure that you join us for our next session. That's going to be on Tuesday, August 15th at 10 a.m. So same time, same station as we have now in 2 weeks. And we're going to be focusing on disaster response and what to do in the first 48 hours. So that will be the next thing that we look at. I have one last thing here. Video will go up this afternoon, and people can see it on Facebook by going to @Kentucky Humanities. The website is kentuckyhumanities.org. So our next session will be on disaster response. And I think that answers our last question. I want to thank you and turn things back to Kentucky Humanities to close our session. Thank you, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thanks to Jan, Tom, and Elena for their insights, and to our sponsor, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and to the many individuals and organizations that shared photos and video footage, our sincere appreciation. We also want to thank you for joining us for this Disaster Preparedness online series session and encourage you to fill out our survey immediately following this event. If you're interested in reviewing the information covered in today's session, you'll be able to find a recording at kyhumanities.org or on our Kentucky Humanities YouTube channel. For Kentucky Humanities, I'm Bill Goodman.